I appreciate the opportunity to be included in this lecture series. You've had some great speakers. I'm thrilled to get to have the last word and correct all of their misstatements, so I'm going to save plenty of room for that. But my first question is, do these class evaluations reflect on me or you?
You might not get tenure if they come up after.
I'm not looking for tenure, so that's good. All right, well anyway, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you all and hopefully hear some of your perspectives as we move through this. I suspect I'm going to repeat a lot of what you've heard already, and I'll try to keep that to a minimum and get to just my perspectives on where California water policy is and where it's going and what we need to get it to a good place and open the discussion. The title, what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? Well, first of all, Elvis Costello is just cool, so that's enough reason for the title. But, you know, frankly, I get pretty frustrated with media coverage of water in California. I think we tend to glorify California's historic water wars, and I think that does us a disservice. There's certainly plenty of things to fight about out there. I think maybe it's been a while since somebody actually got shot over a water dispute in California, but plenty of disagreements. Our system sort of cultures and fosters those the disagreements, I think. But I think there's also a lot of consensus these days and movement towards a shared vision, at least an emerging vision of sustainable water management for California. So that's what I want to talk about a bit today. But first I'm asking for pledges from all of you to join me in Elvis Costello's approach to talking about water and asking you never again to quote Mark Twain. If I ever hear that water quote again, and I'm going to say it, I hope you know what it is. Ask your friends if you don't know what it is, but I never want to hear it again. So let's try a little peace, love, and understanding. All right, some basic Water 101. I'm sure you've heard a whole lot of this before, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. We've got a big growing population, a stable, big irrigated agricultural industry in California. And of course, the penultimate fact about California water, about 2/3 of it originates north of Sacramento, about 2/3 of it is used south of Sacramento, and right in between you've got one of the most important estuaries on the west coast. So adds to the challenge of getting water from its place of origin to its place of use. But that hasn't stopped California. We, over the last century or longer, have developed an amazing plumbing system to help move water from place of origin to place of use and to redirect its timing so that it's there when we need it and not there when we don't need it. I think what's interesting is a lot of this development has been sort of haphazard in a lot of ways, actually driven by whatever level of government happened to be empowered at the time and generally responsive to events of the day. So here's a slide that shows some timeline on investments in flood management in particular across California, going back to 1890 to 1930 when you saw a lot of different local entities taking on flood management for themselves and implementing their own projects. 1930 to 1960, a big era of federal investment in flood facilities and water supply infrastructure in California in general. 1960 to 1990, an era of state and local investment in water projects. And from 1990 till now, we've sort of lived in this world of general obligation bond investment, sort of spurring investment in big projects across California. And the question is, what comes next? We face a lot of challenges in California water, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of this over the last few weeks. Really starting with just system deficiencies. We may need to make a lot of investment now, a lot of high dollar investment now just to correct problems with the system that we developed over the last century. I would put the Bay Delta Conservation Plan in that category. You see new screened intakes going in for different water supply systems across California almost continuously. So a lot of investment just to sort of modernize our systems. Plus, a lot of that infrastructure is old and aging and needing repair and replacement. So we're spending a lot of money just sort of to keep the same water supply reliability that we enjoy today. Beyond that, of course, we're all very aware of the issues regarding the Bay Delta, the declining ecosystem, the concurrent loss and degradation of water supply reliability that goes along with that. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, whether I want to or not. Drought, obviously an expected part of our hydrologic cycle. We ought to be ready for drought when it occurs. It's part of living in California, but it tends to occur sort of like a pop quiz for California water infrastructure to test the resiliency of our system from time to time. And we need to do a better job of just incorporating a response to drought into our normal way of managing water in California. And then, of course, climate change is the real game changer for California water resources planning and natural resources planning in general. Unprecedented challenges. I'm sure you've heard much about that from previous speakers. Dealing with sea level rise, dealing with loss of snowpack, dealing with changes in runoff patterns where we can expect flashier floods and longer periods of drought. New challenges that we can't even really quantify very well at this point for our water management system in the future. Beyond that, it really just is testing the way that we do water planning itself. We need new and better tools. We know now that relying upon our historical hydrology as a guide for planning for future needs isn't a very good way of doing business. So really just means starting over again in terms of from the bottom up. How do we plan for water resources? How do we implement them? How do we account for the uncertainty that lies ahead? So I think you probably heard some of this, and I think maybe, Jay, this is a little bit similar to some of the things that you've talked about in terms of water policy trends. I think probably this stands to common sense that beginning of the last century, we had a period of great economic development, resources extraction sort of mentality. Beginning in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we began to have a new ethic regarding resources management in California. New laws and policies that placed more emphasis on our natural environment, and that, of course, had great effect on the way that we manage our water system and resulted in a whole lot of conflict. I'm not sure exactly where we are between that box and our ultimate goal of sustainable resources management. I hope we're leading in that direction and maybe have glimpses of actually feeling like that's where we're at, but we've got a ways to go to get where we want to, and that really is just sustainable resources management that implicitly includes consideration of the environmental values and the consequences of investment decisions for improving water supply reliability. Along with evolving California water policy, we've had an evolution of California's water plan that is one of the primary responsibilities of the Department of Water Resources. Just so I have some clue, how many of you have seen a California water plan? That's pretty good. As I say, it has evolved over the years. The first California Water Plan, Bulletin 3, a master plan for California water development. And if I say anything that sounds like I'm dissing the guys that put this together, I don't really mean to, because it is an awesome piece of engineering work for its time and place. I can't even imagine what sort of investment would be needed to reproduce Bulletin 3 from scratch in this day and age, but definitely had that resources development sort of flavor to it. So we moved on. We're required to update the water plan every 5 years. I think this is the 9th edition we're working on now for the 2013 edition. And it has evolved. During much of my career, starting in the 80s, I was involved in working on some of these updates, and what it really got to was defining the difference between supply and demand, and maybe doing some preliminary work on what sorts of projects might go into filling the gap essentially between supply and demand, but more than anything else out of the water plan, that gap was used as a political driver to try to incentivize development of other projects. So much of the rest of the water plan was really sort of unnecessary or at least unused. Now this particular diagram from the 2005 update is particularly genius because I thought of it. This was really one of our first attempts to return to the underlying meaning of the California Water Plan and get back to more of a strategic planning approach. And we took some different directions in Update 2005. We came up with actual goals and objectives and a strategic plan for achieving those goals and objectives. We still included a lot of the basic information on supply, sources of projects that might go towards meeting those supplies, but we also included a broad variety of other water management objectives, water quality, protecting groundwater basins, a number of other things. And this was a struggle, but we brought in at least 20 other state agencies, state and federal agencies, to collaborate on the plan, incorporating their goals into the plan itself. So for the first time, this became more of California's water plan as opposed to DWR's water plan. But the basic notion here was that we have these foundational actions that we need to secure sustainable water uses, use water efficiently, protect water quality, support environmental stewardship, and those were just foundational to whatever we're going to do. Then we have these two key initiatives: implementing integrated regional water management and improving state water management systems, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well, all leading towards this ultimate vision of a vital economy, healthy environment, and high standard of living. Well, as genius as I thought this pyramid shape was, it resulted in a whole lot of fighting, and I forced its way into Update 2005, but as soon as I wasn't directly involved, they replaced it with this sort of swishy thing that I guess it says the same thing, but it made lots of people happy, but except me. Anyway, it's the same notion, a shared vision, an attempt to really for the first time to align the actions that local agencies do and the actions that state and federal agencies do towards a common vision, and that's kind of the theme of really what I'm trying to talk about today. Let's see what else here. A lot of other improvements have gone into the water plan over the last few years. We're working on having more of a finance plan in this edition of the water plan. Sustainability indicators. This is a really important topic, I think. We can talk about sustainability, but how do you translate that back into real water planning? Increased emphasis on further integration of flood management, other types of actions into a total resources sort of approach to water planning, and more outreach, particularly outreach to tribes and consideration of how to advance environmental justice issues. So a little bit on those two key initiatives again. First of all, integrated regional water management. Does that term mean anything to you all? Show of hands, who's heard of IRWM? Thank you. That's good to hear. This is one of the great secrets of California water, I think, over the last decade. We've actually made some very good progress in moving this theory forward, and it's resulted in a lot of benefit for California water management. Notion is pretty simple. We've got this really diverse, intricate system of water governance in California. A lot of different agencies with very specific responsibilities and authorities. If we can provide some incentive for them to work together towards common objectives, there's got to be some efficiency that we can squeeze out of those agencies' actions and investments, and that's really what it's all about. We're emphasizing a portfolio approach, of course. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Think about water planning in terms of risk management. and the whole notion here is that we're lucky to have the tool of state GO bonds to provide money for incentive for local agencies, but if they can meet certain planning objectives that the state requires, then they've got their priority list of projects, their goals and objectives. We'll cost share with them to further leverage their own local investment to promote water management, and it's worked extremely well. Let me just go back to this one for a second. These blotches are all of the different IRWM planning efforts going on, at least as of a couple of years ago. It really is amazing. Of course, all of them, not all at the same level of sophistication or evolution, but at least we've got conversations going in almost blanketing the state at this point. So I don't know why I have this slide, it's just cool. I think the notion here is we're also trying to align land use planning with water planning, and that of course is one of the key benefits of the IRWM approach. We have historically avoided any discussion about land use planning in the water world, and at least this gives us a touch back to those cities and counties that actually do have some authority over land use, and we're really trying to push it in that direction. So I guess I didn't have a slide on this, but again, back to the investment that California has made. We have at DWR, thanks to Proposition 50 and Propositions 84, awarded over $600 million. That's a lot of money in grants to leverage about a $3.5 billion investment from local agencies since Proposition 50 back in 2002, I believe. And we estimate that those investments alone have secured about 2 million acre-feet of water per year on average, either in new supply development or demand reduction. So that's a pretty considerable point of progress, and one that is often not reported. And if I hear anybody else tell me that these water bonds of the past have not had any water in them because they don't have hard water infrastructure, well, anyway, I'll have to take another pledge to ask for nobody to repeat that myth. The other key initiative, of course, statewide actions. Again, we're trying to better align the actions of state and federal agencies and those of local and regional agencies towards these common objectives. So when I speak of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan as part of integrated water management, I mean that it has to be multi-objective, multi-purpose. It has to fit within the be integrated with the actions of local agencies. So for instance, we're not going to achieve our water management objectives for California by improving delta conveyance alone. We know that we've got to continue to improve water conservation, improve water recycling, improve groundwater management, all those other actions that local agencies really have their hand on the wheel to implement. So we're not looking for a silver bullet here. We're trying to take all these actions in package and in total to meet our overall planning needs. So Bay Delta Conservation Plan, of course, that's probably the premier example of a plan or a program that is really under the authority of state and federal agencies, and that's the way we're pursuing it. And we can talk about that more if you like later. Another statewide action, of course, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. This is another pretty big achievement for the Department of Water Resources last year, based upon legislation that was passed back in 2006, 2007. We went about taking on really the biggest master planning for Central Valley flood management over the last several decades, and worked through a number of issues. We got the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to adopt the plan last year. Now we're breaking that down into a regional planning effort where we've broken the Central Valley into 5 or 6 different regions where we're asking local agencies to get engaged to flesh out some of the details of what actions they would take in concert with the system-wide improvements that the state or federal government would be responsible for. And I actually think it's pretty good. When we were going about adopting the plan, I had somebody on my calendar at least once a week to complain and tell me about their point of view, and I haven't heard anything about this for 6 months, so we must be in great shape. All right. Finally, the last slide I have here anyway, I just wanted to get this advertisement out there. We are serious about integrated water management. We want to make it a priority for the state of California and for the Department of Water Resources. So just to continue to try to get the word out there and get some publicity and some interest in this approach, we're going to hold a summit on April 3rd, and that will be followed April 4th and 5th by an integrated regional water management conference where we hope to have a number of folks that are actually implementing those sorts of planning processes and projects, and to share their experiences and maybe get some value out of considering what's worked and what hasn't worked across the state. So I really, with that, want to just talk a little bit about some of the challenges moving forward with improving water planning, water resources management towards this integrated water management goal. And I have 3 general recommendations that I want to throw out. 2 of them, I think, probably pretty much in your wheelhouse here at UC Davis. And one of them that, if you can help me with, you'll probably be eligible for a Nobel Prize someday. But let's just leave it at that. First of all, improving planning tools. Now this is something that, as Jay and I were walking over here, he is describing programs that you all will be working on to start that effort, or to continue that effort actually. It's a never-ending effort to come up with new planning tools. But as I spoke of earlier, I think it's just critically important that we get a better handle on updating our planning processes, moving away from the old gap analysis and counting on historical hydrology to guide what we expect in the future, and develop a more robust system of analyzing risk management, basically. It's a sort of approach that is common in other sorts of planning, but we're just slow to get there, I think, in water resources planning, and we just needed some new tools, new approach, new thinking to help us reinvent water management planning. A couple of examples of what I'm talking about. How do you measure resiliency in a system? You know, it's easy for me to stand here and say we need to plan for climate change. Well, what the heck does that mean? You know, if we add 500,000 acre-feet of water conservation, or add a 9,000 CFS conveyance facility in the Delta, what does that do particularly to help us out in measurable ways towards improving California water management? So we need tools to help us define and measure resiliency and sustainability, for that matter. Another example, how do you value ecosystem function and health? And this is one of the key issues that we're dealing with in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. Really still, to this day, one of the key issues we deal with water management. How do you do water management in light of total natural resources management? So understanding that connection, understanding how to value. There's risk involved in taking actions to improve the ecosystem. Bay Delta Conservation Plan is a great example. We're talking about investment of over 100,000 acres of restored habitat, tidal wetlands, floodplain habitat in the Delta. On top of that, we're talking about the need for maybe another 1 million acre-feet of additional outflow in the Delta. Those things cost money. They come out of California's economy. How much risk management do we need to ensure that we're going to have a sustainable ecosystem? It's easy to take the most conservative approach, but we don't have unlimited resources in terms of funding to implement planning, so we need a more intelligent way of making those decisions. So that's number one. Number two, again, I think this is in your wheelhouse, improved investment in science. Again, as I just said, the biggest conflicts are still in resources management. We don't understand what we're doing enough to really judge adequately what our actions will result in. We need better connection between scientists and policymakers in the future. More data collection, more synthesis of that data, and really just better communication. And I know this is a common theme. I've heard it a lot. I'm surprised when I talk to folks about it. There is equal and vehement frustration on the part of scientists and policymakers about this communication gap. So there's got to be another discipline out there that can help us both to get better at talking to each other. It's going to take more money. We need more money devoted to science, but that's got to pay off. The folks that we're going to ask to invest in that science probably are going to be concerned that it not be used against them to over-regulate or take that conservative approach more often than not. So it's one of these chicken and egg things. To get the money for the investment, we've got to show signs that we're actually able to communicate and move forward effectively. And then finally, the one where this is ripe ground for a Nobel Prize, improving governance of water. We inherit a system that is a legacy system. I don't know how we got to where we are, but here we are. Multi-levels of governments, diverse authority, sometimes conflicting authorities, and we're all supposed to make that work to the public's benefit. As we've done with the water plan in recent years, I think it's critically important that we re-examine and clarify the roles that we all play. We need to start with a common vision, common goals, and align our actions to try to reach those goals. And that's at the federal, state, regional, local level. There are tools that we can implement to help us get there, like integrated resources planning, integrated regional water management planning. But it's going to be critical that we find a way to better do that so that we're all moving towards the same objectives. We need a stable system for financing water projects and programs. Right now, as one of my earlier slides noted, we generally get big state or federal investments after we've had some sort of crisis. That's not a real great way to plan for the future. We need to be able to reward local investment, and that's one of the great things about the IRWM approach. It's amazing what we've been able to do. In some cases, what we're essentially offering local agencies is a 10% off coupon to go make a big investment in their water future, and that really drives activity. It's amazing. They don't want to lose out on that. So they lurch forward in their planning processes and come up with new approaches and learn how to work together to make them happen. That's the really exciting thing when you see two local agencies that have historically drawn up a big fence between them and not cooperated, find a way to cooperate in order to get our little bit of money we want to offer them. It's a real success. But we've got to find a way to strengthen and stabilize that sort of funding if we're going to continue it. We've been, as I say, lucky to have general obligation bond financing to provide that incentive for the past decade or so. But that funding's about to run out. We'll have to pass another GO bond. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But I don't think the GO bond lottery is the most stable approach to this sort of system. This is one of the real existing third rails in water management. If I even talk about a fee on water use that might support this type of program, I'd be run out of the room in most meetings of water agencies in California. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know that we need a more stable source of funding. I think it's important to have a source of state funding. It provides us this vehicle to drive state policy down in an incentive-based approach to local agencies, and we've actually got a whole lot of bang for our buck out of that. I think over the past decade we've pushed local agencies to consider climate change, to consider their greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think they would have taken that stuff on if not for our planning requirements. So a lot of possibility there, but it's going to take a lot of guts to come up with a source of stable funding to make that a reality moving forward. And then streamlining regulations. Again, part of this notion of how do we align our governance system in a more creative way. If I had to tell you what I think one of my primary accomplishments as director of the Department of Water Resources over the last 3 years. It has been to get us out of court. We are in a situation where we have disagreements on science, we have disagreements on the way that Endangered Species Act requirements are placed upon project operations, and when we don't like it, we sue somebody. And you cannot have a collaborative science program, you can't have a really productive science program when your scientists are defending a litigation position. That's just the bottom line. That works both from the point of view of the defendants and the plaintiffs. So what we've been attempting to do, and we haven't proven the theory yet, but we're trying, is to get out of the courtroom, show that we can work together collaboratively, make an investment in science so that we have a common basic understanding of cause and effect in the Delta, for instance. And hopefully that will lead to a place where there's basic agreement on what regulations are required in order to protect the ecosystem and to provide for water supply reliability in California. So it's a work in progress. There's been some great dialogue between agencies that have been spent the last decade primarily seeing each other in court. But again, the theory has to be proven. We've got to make some progress, and it seems like every day there's a test to our tentative collaborative approach. The permitting processes are just basically unwieldy at this point. I think you know, the fact that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is going to be 17,000 pages long, I think that speaks volumes in itself. There's just a basic misalignment of some of the planning requirements. Simple things like different baseline requirements for doing analysis of your project, from Endangered Species Act to NEPA to CEQA. That's why you have to have 17,000 pages, because you have to do the same problem evaluation 3 different ways for starters. And it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't really add to the planning process. So just some basic alignment of those types of things to streamline permitting processes and planning processes associated with permitting, I think, is just essential. And then finally, wildlife agencies are just really struggling. At least that's my perspective, having spent a lot of time with both California Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks over the last few years. They need more capacity if we're going to ask them to do what we're asking them to do. There's simply not enough bodies, not enough expertise to move their processes ahead in a timely way. And beyond that, we've got to find a way to provide incentive for wildlife agencies to work towards solutions. When you're overwhelmed, it's easy to take the most conservative approach and basically cover your own interests, but that generally doesn't solve the problem. So we've got to find a way to provide some incentives for wildlife agencies to be able to think creatively, maybe take a little risk now and then in order to move us towards collaborative solutions. So anyway, that last one was kind of long and convoluted, but if you can find a way to align regulations, governance, financing, we might get somewhere in California water. So anyway, my conclusions. I think that we have a much clearer idea of what we need to do these days compared to when I started in California water 3 decades ago. I think there's a whole lot of agreement about the need for sustainable water management, for planning for climate change, for taking this risk management approach, for investing in water conservation, improving water recycling, doing all the things in that portfolio that we know are going to be essential. What we're struggling with is how to do it, how to pay for it. So that's the next big challenge, reforming, aligning governments, regulation, financing, all towards this broader integrated water management ethic. That's the future. So I'm going to answer my question. There's nothing funny about peace, love, and understanding. Let's give it a chance. Thank you.
questions?
Hi, my name is Danielle Dolan. I'm a huge proponent of IRWM as a philosophy, but I'm a bit skeptical of its effectiveness and the implementation of it, especially here in California, with the level of intricacies needed in the application process for the grants, et cetera. And I was wondering, in this next round of updates to the IRWM guidelines, what you would suggest for aligning those permitting processes and streamlining the application process so that more organizations and agencies can be involved with IRWM. And also, are there any measurements of success or ways that you're evaluating the effectiveness of the program as a whole?
Yeah, great questions. I'd say that the chief thing that I've learned from my experience with IRWM is the need for stability and slow evolution of any sort of requirements that we're going to place on folks. And again, this kind of gets to my frustration about the start and stop nature of the funding that we've been able to provide. While we've had a bankroll, basically, thanks to Prop 50 and Prop 84, those funds are subject to appropriation. Of course, we're just emerging from a pretty dark time, California finances, and so those appropriations weren't coming for a while. So when you set local groups off to collaborate and invest in these expensive planning processes, and give them the rules and your expectations, and then they go through all of that, and you don't have the grants to provide them as a reward, that's not good. That doesn't provide the kind of motivation we're looking for. In fact, it sets us back. So having consistent funding and a regular schedule, and if we're planning on making a change in what we're going to require in IRWM plans, signal that well ahead of time, maybe a grant cycle or two ahead of time before we actually require people to do it. That's the main thing I've learned from dealing with folks that are engaging in this sort of process. What was the second part?
Measures of success.
Right. Extremely important, and we've done our best to ask people to self-report basically on success, and done as much as we can to sort of verify that the projects that people said they would do actually were implemented and they achieved the benefits that they thought they would. We've actually been working with AQUA, the Association of California Water Agencies, towards doing some look back on that to sort of verify what we were able to achieve and what we weren't. It's been very useful. What we struggle with is that we have a very limited amount of funds that are provided to us to implement these grant programs, and it doesn't really provide a whole lot of money for back checking at the end of the process to be certain for verification purposes. So we struggle. We try to use the money as efficiently as we can, but we're always going to rely upon self-reporting to some extent. It'd be nice to have the opportunity to do a little spot checking anyway, more than we do today, but that's kind of where we're at.
Sounds like a great university research project.
There you go.
Eric.
Thanks. One of the things that seems to restrict the ability of agencies to work together in California, and also limits the ability of scientists to do their job, is the almost total lack of compatibility of the data sets that different agencies collect. For example, CDPH's water quality data set has almost no relationship with DWR's well logs,
right,
and the state board and the USGS. Everybody has different ways of categorizing and IDing their data. What kind of steps is DWR taking, or what do you envision taking to rectify that situation?
Yeah, great question. Something that we've been struggling with for a decade or longer, really since people started talking about databases as an important foundational piece of planning. We've embarked upon several initiatives at DWR to try to come up with things like the water pie, different approaches where we can serve as not a clearinghouse, if you will, but at least a pointer out to different data sets, an index with some standards that go along for those data in order to be part of our network. Frankly, this has been difficult for us to advance. We don't have a whole lot of funding for this type of activity, and certainly our funding's been on the decline over the last decade, particularly in regards to data management. We got to a point, about 6 or 8 years ago where we were trying to decide whether we keep our basic data programs going or produce a California Water Plan update. And we decided it was more important to keep the basic data collection going so that somebody could use those data sets in the future. But I'm certainly an advocate for bigger budgets, smarter use of those funds to the extent we can. I think it's something we're going to have to rely upon the university system to help us with, frankly, to sort of move us forward into the next quantum leap towards data management. But you'll have my support when you come up with a solution, Jay.
Could you, I know the financing side of BDCP and also maybe the water bond is not quite set up, but could you talk about how those two would work together, or what DWR's role in using funds for the water bond would be?
Right. Okay. We had our first big rollout of the first 4 chapters of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan last week. This lecture would have been a whole lot better if I hadn't had that to work on last week. But anyway, over the next a couple of months, 6 weeks or 2 months, we'll roll out the rest of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. The last tranche includes our finance plan. So frankly, we got a lot of work to do between now and then to tighten it up, and so we'll have a good rollout of that. The basic numbers. We think that the present worth costs of the Delta Conveyance Facility that's included in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan is approximately $14 billion. All the other conservation measures, there's 21 other conservation measures, from wetlands improvement to YOLO bypass, floodplain improvement, to addressing water quality issues, to addressing invasive species, so on and so on. All of those other capital improvements or capital requirements add up to just under $4 billion, something like that. Beyond that, if you capitalize all of the operation and maintenance required for the 50-year life of the permit, you end up at, I believe the number is $23 billion. So there's an annual commitment above and beyond those capital requirements. So it's a lot of money. The basic premise of the finance plan at this point is that the water users, the State Water Project and Central Valley Project customers that receive the benefit of the water supply reliability for BDCP would pay for Conservation Measure 1, in other words, the $14 billion capital requirement, plus whatever operation and maintenance is required for that facility, plus the basic mitigation requirements for that facility. Now, Bay Delta Conservation Plan is a habitat conservation plan and a natural communities conservation plan under state law. That means that we are going beyond the avoid jeopardy sort of standard for ecosystem mitigation and towards a recovery standard. So that means that traditionally in HCPs and NCPs, there's a public investment towards that difference because we're all going to benefit from a restored ecosystem as opposed to just a mitigated ecosystem. So that public investment portion that we would expect is something on the order of, let's just call it $3 billion. Maybe a little less than that, maybe a little bit more, plus some annual costs along the way. So it'd be nice to have that and bankroll it right now. We don't, of course. The water bond that was negotiated back in 2009, the $11.12 billion bond, included a chapter for Delta projects. Of that, about $1.5 billion would be directly applicable to these purposes. So if the water bond were to go on the ballot this November, as currently is the plan, and the voters approve that, then that would be $1.5 billion towards that needed investment. for the purposes of a habitat conservation plan and an NCCP, we have to show a viable financing plan over the 50-year life of the program. We don't have to have all that money in the bank at this point in time, but we have to show a viable plan that shows a history of investment, if you will, that makes it likely that we'll be able to raise those monies necessary in order to implement the plan over time. So we believe we can do that between the potential for this GO bond passing, our history of other GO bonds passing that have provided for natural resources over the past decade or two, plus the financial assistance from the federal government, the money they're investing right now in their so-called CalFed programs amounts to maybe as much as $50 million a year, so that's a nice investment towards the needs. So we'll just have to piece all of those sources of funding that we need together to illustrate that we have a viable financing plan. The key question, of course, is whether or not we need the water bond to pass in order for BDCP to be successful. Our answer is no. Obviously, it'd be a great help and great momentum if it does pass, but we do have a nice history of providing for these needs in the past in California, and we think we can rely upon that. Where's the water bond going? No, I don't know. You know, I spent a lot of my time negotiating the terms of that water bond back in 2008, 2009. I would have told you at the time that you're crazy if you even try to touch it and renegotiate it, because it was such a careful balance of parts that got to that political solution. But unfortunately, I don't think I've read a story about the water bond that didn't include the term pork laden in the past couple of years. I think that's a very unfortunate moniker for it. Obviously, there were a few last-minute ads, specific call-outs that you know, they weren't necessary, they weren't important, they're not really in the spirit of the broader investment, but there they are, and the public doesn't like them very much. Certainly the media doesn't like them very much. So the problem is, if we open the water bond, then you test the careful balance that the legislature was able to get to in 2009. I'm not sure if they can do that again under any sort of formula, so it's a real quandary.
More questions? Anybody over this side?
Not until you get over
Come on, give me sketches on.
I love these questions.
Hi, I have an environmental stewardship question that came up during Tim Quinn's talk when he came in here. He talked about the San Joaquin River Valley, and he talked about this idea of a recirculation plan, where instead of diverting water directly before it even gets in the river,
Right.
letting it go into the river, flow through the river, and then divert it at the end of its course and recirculate it back up the valley. I think this is a very good approach, and my own research at the university has looked at the Sacramento Valley in terms of those ideas, but he seemed to have no idea that that was even being thought about in terms of the North of Delta Storage Sites Reservoir is another opportunity to do recirculation in the Sacramento Valley. Mm-hmm. How is this going? Are you getting anywhere with this concept? And how committed is DWR to keeping water in the river? I mean, we can't have a sustainable ecosystem without the water part.
Right. Well, yeah, it absolutely starts with enough flow to provide for ecosystem function. And of course, I can talk a little bit about our approach to that within the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, but back to the San Joaquin River Restoration Program and the San Joaquin River Settlement. Interesting story there. Of course, this was a settlement between NRDC and the federal government and some other parties. The state of California wasn't a party to the litigation, it wasn't a party to the settlement. Of course, we have a stake in the Sacramento River. We're always have been and will continue to be supportive of restoring that river, and the voters were wise enough to pass Proposition 84 that included $100 million, I believe, towards restoration of the San Joaquin River. So we've been working with what was the California Department of Fish and Game, and now the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, on that restoration program in coordination with the Bureau of Reclamation and the San Joaquin parties, and making some progress. There's some real challenges there. One of the real problems that has come to light since the settlement was agreed to was simply the condition of the existing riverbed and system and levees. It is hydrologically impossible to pass the restoration flows down the river right now, so we're trying to come to terms with that. There's not enough money in our flood program to build up the levees down there to provide for those restoration flows, and I personally don't think that's the appropriate approach anyway. So we've got some challenges to deal with. There's a subsidence issue down there with groundwater pumping that's making the problem worse on a daily basis, so we definitely need to come to terms with that. The recirculation part of this was an interesting notion, and maybe it was the glue that kind of brought the deal together. Again, unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of analysis of what it would take to actually accomplish the recirculation. The notion was simple: let's pass the restoration flows down and we'll pump them back up either the California Aqueduct or the Delta Mendota Canal and get them back to the service area where they were originally intended to go based upon the Friant system. The way it works out, because of the existing biological opinions and the rest of the requirements on the project operations and the existing priorities per the contract terms of both the state water project contractors and the federal contractors, moving those recirculated waters would be a very last priority, and it simply doesn't, there's not accommodation to do that often enough to make it worthwhile. So in order to move those recirculation flows, we'd have to take water capacity away from somebody else. So it's a conundrum. We would love to be able to figure out a way to do it because we would like to bring the Friant and exchange contractor community kind of back into the fold of California water management, and this is a good way to make that happen, but it's not a slam dunk. So we'll keep trying to figure out how we can accommodate them. One idea, and I hope this has some merit, is I think there's pretty broad recognition that the San Joaquin River exchange contractors are, dare I say, one of the less efficient water users in California agriculture, with a investment that maybe helps them implement some water conservation measures. We could free up some water. That might create some capacity to actually move some of that recirculation water back to the Friant water user service area. So that's one thing we're working on.
Where do you see the future for levee funds or levee maintenance funding in the Delta in the future when you look at the BDCP after that all goes through? Because a lot of that funding comes because it's the state water project, but where would it go once the water doesn't need to go through the Delta?
Actually, it's not because of the state water project. The levee funding that we've provided for levee subventions, levee maintenance, levee improvements in the Delta has traditionally been either general fund or general obligation bond funding, so it comes out of the public portion of the Department of Water Resources budget. Obviously, the fact that we rely upon Delta levees to move water to the southern part of the state, we rely upon Delta levees to protect other infrastructure of importance to California. That's all part of the justification for a public investment in Delta levees. You know, another one of these myths that I think has been too often reiterated is the notion that we're not making investments in those levees. Since Proposition 1E passed, we've put $300 million into Delta levee improvements, and we've got about $300 million more to invest in Delta levees before that fund is exhausted. So we're doing projects just about as fast as there's capacity to implement projects. It's not a matter of us sitting on our hands and waiting for the Delta to collapse. And I would make this point, our Bay Delta Conservation Planning proposal is for dual conveyance. We're not looking to abandon the Delta. We'll continue to rely upon South Delta exports to the extent we can, consistent with correcting the reverse flow issues in the Delta to provide for a good portion of that supply. So we will continue to have an interest in maintaining those levees for as long as we can, but at the same time we know that risks are increasing, that there will be levee failures in the Delta, so we think it is prudent to have a backup system and a way to move water out of the Sacramento River that's that drives so much of the water use in California, that drives our economy, that we'd be able to move that water in light of the potential for levee failures and flooding in the Delta.
So given that Lockheed Martin announced last week that they're having really good success with the new graphene desalination technique pioneered by MIT, how is DWR positioning itself to kind of take advantage of these new technologies and kind of break out of this Delta levee paradigm and kind of shift focus on sustainable or maybe less sustainable or different sources of water in the future?
Yeah. Well, again, as I tried to portray in my presentation, we're not looking at a silver bullet here. We think that reliable Delta water supplies go hand in hand with continued investment in a portfolio approach on an IRWM basis from local and regional agencies. That includes desalination. It'd be great if there was continuing breakthroughs in technology that drive down costs, drive down greenhouse gas emissions, drive down the ill effects of desalination or any other water management tool that might be out there. Let me take this opportunity just to note this. What we're talking about here is basically a foundational amount of water supply reliability from the Delta. I can't tell you exactly what that number is, but let's just say that if we're exporting 5 million acre feet per year now on average, and we ended up moving to a system that only allowed us to export 3 million acre feet of water from the Delta. That means we need to make up that 2 million acre feet through other local actions. And that could be desalination, could be water conservation, could be better groundwater management, all of those local tools that go into that portfolio approach. However, what if we were able to get by with 4 million acre feet of water exported from the Delta and still maintain a trajectory towards recovery of the Delta ecosystem? That frees up that million acre feet of water that we would have invested just to get back to where we started from towards preparing for these challenges like climate change and growing population that we have in the future. So it really gets down to the economic ability to support those types of investments on top of whatever we can get out of the Delta in a sustainable way. So to answer your question specifically, or more specifically, what we're doing, we'll continue to provide IRWM funds for planning, for implementation. We'll continue to provide guidelines for what we want agencies to do to move towards sustainable water management and encourage them to be taking advantage of new technological breakthroughs and incorporating them into their planning processes.
Hi, I'm Mick Klassen. You've referred to 3 different initiatives of DWR, the IRWM, BDCP, and the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, that all have something to say about how water should be managed. They might have different approaches. Do you have thoughts on the integration of those 3 programs?
Absolutely. Again, it starts with a shared vision. It starts with shared goals and objectives for water supply reliability, for water quality management, for flood management. If we can get to agreement on what we're trying to accomplish, then alignment of those programs that DWR takes on, BDCP or the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, goes hand in hand with IRWM type activities. So they all should be building towards those common objectives. integration is another one of those words, kind of like sustainability or resilience. It's hard to measure. You don't know when you're there. So this is something that, it's real. There are stovepipes wherever you go. I've spent a lot of my time as director of DWR trying to get my different divisions to work better together, to play in the same sandbox and get along and share resources and work towards the same objectives. A lot of people, that comes naturally to them. A lot of people it doesn't. So we'll continue to push towards achieving more real integration even in our own programs. But it is a fight. It's a new ethic, and you have to make the case for it. And if there was a way to measure what integration was, maybe that's another research project for you, Jay.
There's always another research project. I'd like to ask the last question since we're running out of time. I can't imagine that the state of California would ever not have a Department of Water Resources, but its role throughout time is likely to change. You have a room full of people at the beginnings of their careers. What's the prognosis for the Department of Water Resources in terms of all these young people? Should people flock to work at the Department of Water Resources, and why?
Great question.
Well, why should they not?
Well, I came to DWR 32 years ago. I intended to stay a couple years till I got my PE license, then get the heck out, and here I am. Maybe I'm just kind of slow, I don't know, but I never found something else that interested me more. The challenges are just unbelievable. If you like solving puzzles, these are the best puzzles around. Water management in California, you can describe it a lot of different ways, but I truly do believe that we're on the cusp of moving into a new era. And I kind of wish I was just getting started right now, but hopefully we'll continue on and find ways to be more collaborative, be more thoughtful, take the long view more often than we typically have in California water resources planning in the past. DWR is a great place to be, not necessarily for the pension anymore, but beyond that, we have one of the most unique missions and portfolio of programs compared to any other state agency that I know of. So if you have a short attention span, sort of like me, you can work on one thing one day and do something completely different the next day. A lot of interesting topics, a lot of relevant topics. They're important. I think that's probably the reason I've never left. If I was figuring out how to produce license plates, I probably would have lost interest a while ago. But these are problems that are meaningful to all of us, to our children, and it's a real driver and motivation. So come on down. We'll find you a place to work.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.